I think it's accurate to say that biology, or rather, life itself, is essentially a giant, self-propagating chemical reaction. Life forms are enormous chemical superstructures. Compared to the chemicals themselves, even bacteria are huge. But some life forms are so big that they've transcended the scale of mere molecules, and instead they operate as Newtonian objects, roaming around at the cosmic mesoscale, where they're subject to Newtonian physics, like mass acceleration under the force of gravity, or as a medium through which heat can move. Consider this example. When we look at animals that live in the Arctic, we often see that they're larger than their temperate and tropical counterparts. Polar bears are the largest kind of bear, and moose are one of, if not the largest ungulate. The reason that these Arctic and subarctic creatures are so large is because their environment is very cold. These organisms have a high volume relative to their surface area, and because they're endothermic, their bodies generate internal heat. Every unit of volume generates heat, and because there's a proportionately low surface area relative to their internal volume, this heat can't rapidly radiate away from their bodies, and so their bodies stay warm, and this protects them in the cold. This is a perfect example of a living chemical superstructure adapting to the Newtonian pressures of its environment. It is a perfect manifestation of the foundational biological principle that form follows function. The biology is a functional fusion of supersized chemistry and physics. Now, this is a principle that I want you to be familiar with before I introduce today's news. Recently, there's been some fascinating research coming out of Ohio University regarding dinosaurs. Specifically, what their fossils can tell us about dinosaur thermoregulation. Many dinosaur species evolved to be absolutely massive, with a colossal volume to surface area ratio. If we consider our example of the moose and the polar bear, this raises a critical question. How did the dinosaurs cool themselves off well enough to stay alive? If they're generating heat throughout their bodies, but they have relatively low surface area, then they would necessarily have a lower rate of heat loss. Add into this equation the fact that dinosaurs typically did not live in Arctic environments. They lived in much warmer, much more humid, temperate, subtropic, and tropical environments. So the problem here is that if the dinosaurs couldn't lose heat fast enough, they would literally cook themselves alive with their own body heat. They would cook their own brains. They would give themselves heat stroke. Clearly, the dinosaurs evolved some mechanism to avoid this broiling fate. The researchers from Ohio University, led by Professor Lawrence Whitmer and Assistant Professor Ruger Porter, sought to address this question and examine how exactly dinosaurs kept themselves cool enough to avoid self-inflicted heat death, despite their large size. Describing the context of their work, Dr. Whitmer explains, quote, "Small dinosaurs could have just run into the shade to cool off. But for those giant dinosaurs, the potential for overheating was literally inescapable. They must have had special mechanisms to control brain temperature, but what were they?" Unquote. The assistant professor, Mr. Porter, said, quote, "One of the best ways to cool things down is with evaporation. The air conditioning units in buildings and cars use evaporation, and it's the evaporative cooling of sweat that keeps us comfortable in the summer. To cool the brain, we looked to the anatomical places where there's moisture to allow evaporative cooling, such as the eyes, and especially the nasal cavity and the mouth." Unquote. To test this idea, they first studied bird and reptile skulls, using CT scans to map out the pathways of their veins and arteries. They traced the grooves in the bone where major blood vessels were positioned, and they mapped out the vasculature that connected to the brain. Mr. Porter explained, quote, "The handy thing about blood vessels is that they basically write their presence into the bones. The bony canals and grooves that we see in modern-day birds and reptiles are our link to the dinosaur fossils. We can use this bony evidence to restore the patterns of blood flow in extinct dinosaurs and hopefully get a glimpse into their thermal physiology and how they dealt with heat." Unquote. What they found, in essence, was that dinosaurs had evolved different ways to cool down, depending on their size and physiology. Smaller dinosaurs, about the size of a goat or a medium-sized dog, like the pachycephalosaur species Stegosaurus, didn't have regions of concentrated vasculature. Instead, they had pretty evenly distributed vasculature. Because they were relatively small, they didn't really need to have dedicated heat loss structures built into their anatomy. Mr. Porter said, quote, "That makes physiological sense because smaller dinosaurs have less of a problem with overheating. But giants, like sauropods and ankylosaurs, increased blood flow to particular cooling regions of the head, far beyond what was necessary to simply nourish the tissues." Unquote. Mr. Porter goes on to describe how some of the largest dinosaurs, like the sauropods, may have needed to pant as a mechanism to cool down. He said, quote, "Panting sauropods may have been a common sight." Unquote. With respect to the giant theropods, like Tyrannosaurus rex and Allosaurus, they identified the disproportionately large air sinuses in their snouts. By studying the T-Rex anti-orbital air sinus, they found that it was heavily vascularized. Their snouts would have been hotspots full of warm blood, and every time they opened their mouth, some of that heat would escape. Because the vasculature had a very high surface area and was close to an exposed region of the body, the heat would be taken away through the evaporative cooling of warmed saliva and through the exhalation of hot air through their mouth and nose. Basically, the T-Rex would have had really hot breath, because this was a primary way for them to cool themselves down. Now consider some other large dinosaurs, like Spinosaurus, or the smaller Dimetrodon, which both had large webbed fins protruding from their back. These large fins are essentially giant sheets of thin vascularized tissue. They're anatomical structures with a very low volume to surface area ratio, which means that they're really good at getting rid of waste heat and cooling the dinosaur down. Interestingly, Spinosaurus has a narrow snout. It doesn't have the large sinus cavities found in Tyrannosaurus rex, and this is most likely because it relied on its back fin to cool off, instead of relying on breathing through its mouth and its heavily vascularized nose, like Tyrannosaurus rex. Dr. Whitmer and Mr. Porter are continuing their research by expanding their analysis to include the duck-billed hadrosaurs and the ceratopsians with their large horns and protective skull frill. They figured that these giant dinosaurs will have their own unique methods of heat removal, akin to the unique mechanisms found in sauropods and theropods. Like I said, this kind of research is really cool because it demonstrates how living systems really are these chemical superstructures, integrating into their habitats by adapting to the physical forces and the selective pressures that act upon them. As Dr. Ian Malcolm said in Jurassic Park, life, finds a way.